Welcome to the 39th episode of the Hail Mary podcast. I'm A. Toves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to give our hot takes on our win over Middle Tennessee and throw some Hail Mary shots downfield for listeners to love or hate. Let's get started. The Triangle traveled. UTSA started off conference play with a win. Leading up to the game, there had been a lot of talk about Middle Tennessee's upset over number 25 Miami the prior week. The Roadrunners knew they would need to come out strong to set the tone of the game, and that's exactly what they did. The offense seemed unstoppable, racking up 346 yards in the first half and scoring 31 points from 2 passing touchdowns to Zachary Franklin, 2 rushing touchdowns, one from Traylon Smith and the other from Frank Harris, and a 20-yard field goal from Jared Sackett. The defense was dominant in the first quarter, shutting out Middle Tennessee. While they let them get in the game in the second quarter, at halftime, UTSA held what appeared to be a dominant 31-20 lead. The second half of the game was a different story. After the Roadrunners methodically marched down the field for a second Frank Harris touchdown, the game started to take a turn, with Harris throwing an interception on the next 3 possessions. Middle Tennessee was able to score 10 points on the turnovers to make the game competitive. The defense came up with key stops when they were needed, and Brady broke off a 25-yard touchdown run late in the fourth quarter to put the game out of reach. The Roadrunners came away with a 45-30 victory, spoiling Middle Tennessee's blackout homecoming and ending the series at 4-1. What were your thoughts on the game?
First of all, it was weird, right? Because it was the first time that we haven't been in person at one of the games.
I know. We've gone to all of the games so far this year. That's a first.
It is a first, and so it was weird, having to do when we did our rewatch, that we actually, were watching what we had actually seen.
Yeah.
When I say that, it was the same screen, same things we had seen as opposed to being in the stands, right? So, anyway, fun time out at Perry's. That's where we got to watch it. Though I will say, Atovs here wanted to do some celebratory shots and decided to go with Jameson because that's what she likes. She likes herself a nice Irish whiskey.
Absolutely.
But I will tell you that if there is ever a cause for a concern with the Atovs, it's she's had a bad day when she says, "I need a Jameson neat." That means it's been a long day. I'm just glad that wasn't the case after this game. So second of all, this seemed more like a silver out instead of a blackout, right? I mean, there was so many empty seats.
I know. So much for a sellout.
Silver out. You're welcome, Middle Tennessee marketing department. Also, they kind of blew it, right? Because it felt like they could have at least sold more tickets because of the fact that, I don't know, they just upset number 25 Miami. And they could have just come in and said, hey, our team's really good. They're going to upset the defending conference champions. And A, they didn't. B, nobody really cared, apparently.
I know. There was allegedly 15,000 tickets sold. Not even probably that many people in the stands. And apparently like a 3-man heckling crew on the sideline, according to the post that JJ had. I mean, I think that was kind of like the people that were into the game until they saw what the Roadrunners could do.
Felt like the old school Bad Birds when you
Right.
had like the 3 or 4 guys that are just like heckling the whole time. I think they tweeted as much, so that was a good comparison to whoever did that. Yeah, I mean, I just thought it was weird. Like, it just really felt like Middle Tennessee the whole time. The reason I'm bringing up the Miami game is because I felt like they kept patting themselves on the back for it. Throughout the game, I expected them to have their moments, and they did. I'm not saying they didn't, but it just felt like they were trying to make plays, and they kept going, well, Miami fell for this. And it felt like the response from UTSA was, cool, but we're not Miami. We're not going to break. We're strong enough not to be as mentally fragile as Miami was. So,
I mean, in reality, they only scored 20 points. We gifted them 10 on our interceptions.
Correct. So, I mean, I will say this. In my opinion, all these teams go through peaks and valleys, right? I mean, clearly Middle Tennessee is going through a valley because they came off this high of the, Miami upset victory, and then all of a sudden they lose. And to me, they lost in a very convincing fashion. It would have been different. I really thought it was going to be closer. I thought they would still be upbeat about that upset win and really bringing that momentum in against UTSA. They clearly didn't. And UTSA really responded. We had ask the questions of, are they going to come in with energy? Are they going to be ready to play? Since against Texas Southern, they really didn't show that. And they did. And, to me, I think there were a lot of things that stood out to me, but one of the major things was that, as I'm looking at it, I would say that most of the bad teams have peaks and valleys, but they go from game to game. Like, you have one great win, and then you have one that, a loss. Mm-hmm. And that's your peaks and valleys. Where I feel like for UTSA, we had a quick peak against Houston, and then we started taking a slight downward on the other side of the mountain against Army, because we didn't play as well, but we still came away with the victory. And then we had the pit of the Texas game, where you kind of felt like, we just couldn't tackle anybody. We clearly kind of seemed somewhat overmatched at times. Even though we hung with them for a little while, it just seemed like, this isn't the game that we had anticipated, especially once the final score came out. And then you had Texas Southern, and it felt like we were still sort of in the valley, kind of still digging out, but we're kind of on an upwards trajectory going towards another peak, which that's what I think encourages me, because it makes me feel like this team still has plenty of room for improvement. And rather than just kind of wallow in, look at all these mistakes, because we will talk about some of these mistakes, but just wallowing in all these mistakes and wondering about this team and why they're not showing how great they are, I feel like they're going to begin to show, now that they're in Conference USA, why they were favored and why they are one of the top, I'd say the top class of CUSA. You have any thoughts on that?
No, I totally agree. I mean, it was good to see them, celebrating this win, kind of getting back into the mindset that I think they're going to need for the rest of the season as well.
Yeah, and I think, some of the things I saw, and I think what brought me some encouragement here was you saw the speed, I think, that was kind of next level. Normally when I saw this kind of speed, you'd always see it as from an opponent's point of view, and it felt like, wow, if UTSA ever gets that type of speed, they're going to be pretty good. Now I'm seeing it from UTSA's point of view, and it feels so much better. And, there was a lot of we had missed tackles, but there was a lot of kind of going towards the ball. There was a lot of, the players going there and rallying there. So I guess for me, I'd say this. Offensively, we were cooking. Defensively, we struggled. And yeah, it wasn't 4 quarters, but I still think the best is ahead of them. And I'm going to continue kind of reiterating that as we kind of go along, because I still feel like this team will continue growing, and it's going to feel good once I think we get there. Hopefully it all comes together for the championship game, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, before we get into the reviews, any last minute thoughts?
Yeah, we were surprised by a couple of the guys that came back into the game. We talked in the preview about who we thought we might see. Traylor kind of made it sound like we weren't going to get anybody back. And then, as the game, the guys were going out and warming up, we started seeing tweets from Greg Luca about different guys being back. Traylon Smith played, Joe Evans, Brandon Matterson, Dadrian Taylor. So we started to kind of, I think, start to feel good as the guys hit the field, seeing, more and more of these guys that we weren't necessarily anticipating being able to play in pads on the field.
I thought the big one was Day, because it felt like his injury was going to be like a long-term one. At least that's the way it was kind of played up to be. And while his brother was going to probably take his spot there, it just felt like we were really losing some leadership there. But certainly encouraging to me to see him back. It was good to see Joe Evans, who kind of also seemed like it might be sort of a long-term thing. Brandon Matterson came back. With Joe and Brandon, you weren't really sure what those injuries were, so it was always kind of a cause for concern, because it did feel like, I don't want to say hopeless, but it just kind of felt like, are we going to see them back this season? And it feels like, while it's a position that you could afford to lose some guys, certainly you don't want to start losing them this soon, especially these two talented guys. Mm-hmm. I think one of the funnest comebacks was Traylon. I think, it was good to ease him back in, because I think he's going to be really crucial over the next few weeks.
Absolutely.
So let's go into special teams review. Oof, that kick return coverage.
Yeah. It's interesting because at the beginning of the season, and I think I said this last week as well, we did a good job against Houston, but these last couple of weeks, it's just not been great. And, Traylor kind of made it seem like it was because we've had some kids injured that normally play on special teams. Not entirely sure. But, we definitely gifted a lot of yards to Middle Tennessee and gave them good field position to start their drives. Fortunately, they didn't really take advantage of it as much as they could have. But, again, we don't necessarily want to do that on a regular basis. And it was sort of odd because it seemed like they were asking Jared to kick like shorter, kick returns so that they wouldn't necessarily be able to return the ball. But it didn't seem to matter because even when he did that, they still seemed to, be able to get more yardage than if he would have just really focused on trying to kick it out the backfield.
Yeah, that's a good insight there, because I think we both kind of wondered outside of the pod, why don't they just have Jared just blast the ball out of the back of the end zone? I mean, in some cases when you're in the outdoor stadium, it could be like the wind could, get a hold of it. It felt like there wasn't really any wind there, so why not just kick it out of the end zone like you could see that Jared does routinely?
Yeah, I was going to say, he's got the leg strength to do it. So it's not an issue where if he's trying, typically they're falling short. I mean, he usually is blasting it out. But, obviously you can tell when he's kicking them in their, shorter, that he's being told to do it. It's not the way he kicked it. It seems like it's being done on purpose.
Yeah, so and speaking of Jared, made a very clean field goal. So
absolutely.
We've had some fun going back and forth with.
And he got over his yips.
Yeah, wondering, is he going to go back to his yips? But it looks like maybe he's got his footing under him again, and it's good because we do want that consistency. Even in saying that, you also have to understand that he does kick some longer kicks. So because of it, he is going to go through these, I would say valleys as well, peaks and valleys as a kicker. Though you'd want him to minimize those valleys. So anyway, let's move on to the offense. And let's do the preview review. So one of the first things I had said was keys to victory for the offense to manufacture a run game. Overall, we had 45 rushes for 167 yards, which is 3.7 average. Now, this was lower yardage because of the sack yardage. Frank was sacked 3 times for about 38 yards. So you take out those stats, and we really get into about like a 4-ish type of yards per carry, which falls in line with the usual Traylor type of rushing offense, which is about 4 yards. But I thought that the rushing game did pretty well. That said, the second key to victory was protect Frank. Interesting, because that's what they said on the broadcast as well. They need to protect Frank. I thought Frank had plenty of time to throw from most of the game. I mean, there's always going to be some times where the offensive line doesn't hold up. Defensive line does some stuff. The defense comes up with some crazy blitz, and it's going to get to Frank. But I thought the offensive line really felt at home against a Conference USA defensive line, even one as talented as Middle Tennessee. We had talked about it in the preview that there was some cause for concern for this defensive line with Jordan Ferguson, Marley Cook, Quindarius Dunnigan, big names, big dudes. They just didn't seem to have the effect on UTSA as, say, Houston did, right, or Texas did.
Yeah, and, we saw Venley had the highest PFF grades, first of all, that he's had since he's been a Roadrunner, higher than any of the other Roadrunners, and actually one of the highest, across the G5. So no penalties on his part either, so he seems like he's really coming into his own. Now, I'm certain those PFF grades are probably a bit of an anomaly, but, if he plays close to that for the rest of the season, I think we'll be in great shape.
I like that you brought up Venley, because for me, again, he's a guard, and the fact that he's had to play tackle, I think you're right, he is starting to kind of feel that, but I think he also is starting to really have a better connection with the rest of the line. And I think that's key too. It's difficult for a newcomer to come in and fit in with any line. In this case, the fact that you're taking over for Spencer, who is having already a pretty good career with the Niners, that's always going to be even tougher. So, good to see him have some success.
Yeah, and Frankie seems to be, improving as well against Conference USA, although it sounds like maybe Mekhi Hart will be coming back soon. So, hopefully he'll be healthy and Frankie can, just take some backup reps and continue to develop in that position.
Biggest thing here, though, as much as, we've, been, I think, all just kind of been standing behind Frankie even through his struggles, is that it's now created depth. Depth that we were hoping that we didn't get to. It got to that point, but I feel like you have to feel a little bit better that, he now has gone through some of these situations in some big time environments and now can handle some of these things. I think he'll still struggle, but against Conference USA, as you already alluded to, I think he's going to have a much better time having to deal with some of these defensive ends here in Conference USA. Now, you brought this up a little bit, I think, post-game as we were driving home. A tale of two Franks, huh?
Yeah, I said it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. I mean, he set passing yard records in the best of times, but he threw 3 interceptions in the worst of times. I mean, that's not typical to see Frank throw interceptions in general, but to see 3 interceptions, 3 possessions in a row, it was just very out of character for him.
I thought he got just a little, I wouldn't say careless, but it felt like he got in too much of a cruise control. And even though things were kind of going easy for the most part, I really want to say that he just needs to stay a little bit more focused, because I think he lost some of that focus and some of that edge. So let's break down some of those interceptions. I mean, he was sacked 3 times, as we already talked about. But those 3 interceptions, the first 2 were his fault. The third one was just a great play. The first one was near the goal line. It was to J.T. Clark, or intended for J.T. Clark. But he ended up throwing the ball behind J.T. and DeCordian Patterson, the star cornerback for Middle Tennessee, picked it off because he cut it off. Here's the problem. I know people will say, well, it was just a great play by the cornerback. It's not really Frank. But there was no safety help over top. So it was just JT going to the back of the end zone, throw it to the back of the end zone, or throw it to the mid part of the end zone. And you have no problem there, because now it's much more difficult for Patterson to have to make a play. And even if you miss, kind of like he missed an open Oscar Cardenas, I think in the first quarter, he had Oscar wide open. He missed him. All you do if you miss here with JT, you live to fight another day, because you've got another down to come back and get a first down, get a touchdown, whatever. In this case, it cost him a chance to go up another score, and that I think started making things just a little bit more nervy. Wouldn't really say that it really killed momentum, but certainly I think it would have started putting Middle Tennessee away. Now the second one was a little odd, because Terrell Haynes missed his cut block because the offensive line kind of all just shot out to do cut blocks on the defensive line. Well, the defensive lineman didn't fall for it. I think he had already seen it before. So he just went up. Frank should know this. If he had seen any sort of film from Middle Tennessee against Miami, he would have known that Zaylen Woods, and I brought this up during the preview, put up his paw up, tapped the ball to himself, and took it in for a touchdown. This is the second game in a row that Middle Tennessee has had one of their defensive linemen intercept the ball and return it for a touchdown. I wish Frank would have just kind of thought twice about that pass. It feels like for a veteran quarterback like him, you don't make that pass. You hold on to it. You think the thing through. But I think he was still sort of in cruise control. He was still sort of like, I don't know. I just don't know what he was thinking. Maybe that first interception really threw him off, and now he's really starting to get to his head by his second one. Because it was certainly another uncharacteristic mistake. Mm-hmm. Shouldn't have made that throw. I get that Terrell Haynes missed the block, but that's just something that Frank just needs to be aware of. You just can't go through the motion and just try to think you can go right over him. That's being a little bit too cocky, and you just got to be careful in that at that moment. Now the third one, it was short and inside, but if you watch the whole playthrough, DeCorian Patterson makes another terrific play. That one, though, that one by DeCorian was just phenomenal because the concentration that it took for him to be patient for that ball to kind of filter through Zakari's hands and go into DeCorian's, and for DeCorian to finish that catch, because it's one thing to like just outright get the interception. It's another thing to have somebody kind of over you and you have to secure that catch. Sounds easier said than done, but when you do it, it's terrific. And I thought DeCorian Patterson, that was just a terrific interception. That said, I think Frank had obviously a very good performance. It's not to minimize anything that he did or any sort of records that he, broke. It's just that those first two interceptions were just, I think he could do better. And it certainly gives him much more room for growth. That third one, at that point, it felt like, Middle Tennessee, if you're not going to take advantage of any of these, then the game's over anyway. So
right.
Let's talk about the run game real quick. Brendan Brady, 5.2 average rushing average. He had like 19 carries for 98 yards. Man, you've talked about it before where his dad had said something like, oh, he just gets stronger as the game goes on. Mm-hmm. It really did feel like he got stronger as the game went on. He really had some tough runs in there. Ones where, as much as we might talk about the defense missing tackles here in a little bit, Brendan was like taking tacklers with him on a couple of those,
right.
Rushes. So, I don't know, UTSA fans. There's a concern with our defense at times, like missing tackles. But do you want to have our defenders being drugged like 9-10 yards? Like Brendan Brady was dragging, some of the Middle Tennessee defenders. No offense to Brendan, but Brendan's not the biggest running back, yet he was just dragging these guys. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think that was really kind of a slap to Middle Tennessee's face. But hey, I'd rather be on the dishing out end than receiving end. Yeah,
absolutely. And, we've joked about Brendan Brady kind of being like a Swiss Army knife. What else can he do? This game, we saw him tackle that defender that intercepted the ball that was intended for JT Clark. He had a nice, clean tackle. So we kind of can say we've seen him now on offense, defense, and special teams.
The next linebacker, I guess you could
That's
say.
Right.
If we see him blitzing against Western Kentucky, CUSA just better come up with the Swiss Army knife award because he's winning it.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of our defenders tackling, when we get to the defense. But it was a nice, clean tackle he had there. So
wrapped up in everything, man.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to the offensive players of the game. For that, I'm going completely offensive line. They have been a much maligned group. I think everyone has made some sort of mention about, the injuries that have been suffered, just the struggles that they've had. To see them come back and really take control, again, against CUSA line, guys, you guys deserve it. You did a fantastic job in at least battling back, and look forward to them continually improving as we go along. With that, let's get to the defensive review. All right, keys to victory. I had said defensive line and outside linebackers need to make Cunningham uncomfortable, and DL needs to minimize the holes in the line to stunt rushing game. Look, they didn't get a lot of sacks, but they did get pressure on Cunningham, so they didn't let him get comfortable there. And then outside of one big run, Middle Tennessee was pretty much held to like 17 rushes for 31 yards. Mm-hmm. This defense, for as maligned as it is at times for its tackling, that's huge. They gave up a 53-yard touchdown run. It wasn't a great look, especially at the fact that essentially our middle linebackers kind of got drawn into the line. What they were doing, have no idea. I'm sure that'll get cleaned up, but 17 rushes for about 31 yards, that's really good. Mm-hmm. I think Jess Lepp and Coach Traylor will take that any day of the week, especially against some of the tough rushing teams that are coming up in Conference USA play. The second key to victory was secondary coverage is key against these short, quick receivers. Now, Chisholm England is one of the Middle Tennessee receivers. He's a short guy that went for had 2 catches for 160 some odd yards against Miami. He did not play this game. Mm-hmm. That said, I didn't feel like the Middle Tennessee receivers, at least those short, quick ones, really had much of a day. It seems like we really bottled them up. The one that we had problems with was Isaiah Gathings. He was their big receiver, 6'4". He seemed to really attack the middle of the UTSA defense. I just don't understand why Middle Tennessee didn't keep trying to attack the middle, because that seemed to be some of the soft part of the UTSA defense, and they kept just getting receptions there. So a little baffling, but you know what? Middle Tennessee didn't take advantage of it. Well, too bad. This is why you lose games.
Yep.
And that's why you end up with Rick Stockstill for 17 years at about a 51% winning percentage.
But hey, they got their $1.5 million from Miami, so it's all good.
Yeah. Look, the defense was a tale of two halves. The first half gave up 20 points, 19 to 32, 187 yards passing, 1 touchdown. Again, 9 rushes for 82 yards rushing with that 53-yard rushing touchdown. It's only 269 total yards of offense they give up. Second half, totally different story. 3 points, 16 to 25 passing, 181 yards, 9 rushes for 2 yards.
Yep.
Which made it 183 total yards. 65 of those, which were on the final drive that Middle Tennessee had, when pretty much we just kind of went into more of a prevent defense. This defense really came back in the second half after, missing quite a bit of tackles in the first half. I think the thing about the missed tackles is you see our safeties either diving at players' feet, which it's not a great look. Mm-hmm. And it just feels like we've run out of ideas and we don't know how to tackle, so we're just going to dive at their feet and just try to make it look good, right? And I think that's what's really frustrating to anybody watching these games. Why can't we make that tackle? That, or you're trying to wrap up, and for some reason it feels like the opponent has like some sort of gel on them because they're just sliding off of them. It's frustrating, but Traylor had a different explanation today when during the media roundtable. He kept talking about I know that we don't have a great tackling grade, but if that first missed tackle holds them up enough and we can come and gang tackle, then it's a good deal for us. Essentially limiting the yards after the first contact, which is great and all, but if you're going to try to win a championship or repeat again, you're going to have to clean up some of these mistakes. So.
Well, and talk about going into next year with tougher competition in the American Conference. I'm not sure that that's going to be the best strategy long term.
Absolutely. I mean, it's obviously something they have to work on, and you get it why they don't do it because of the fact that, of their depth issues and some of those injuries that have happened. But there is something to it. You're going to have to find a way to get these tackles and make those tackles. It's the only way you go from being a pretty good team to a great team. That said, if you watch the Oklahoma game against TCU, it can happen at any level. If we're having problems tackling, just look at Oklahoma. Not only were they blowing coverages, I mean, they just couldn't tackle. They were taking even worse angles than UTSA was at times. So, I don't know. I mean, we can talk about that to death, but I'd rather not. I'd rather focus on the fact that in the second half, this team came to play. They really shut down Middle Tennessee. They never really gave Middle Tennessee offense a chance to really get in any sort of rhythm or take advantage of some of the things that this defense was willing to give up. So, we can focus on the bad, but I think the great about this is the fact that this team made the necessary adjustments and we got the win, right?
Absolutely.
All right, with that defensive player of the game, I'm throwing a curveball here. I'm going Trey Moore. I've started to get a real soft spot for Trey Moore. Kid really looks the part. Away from the pod, I told you a couple weeks ago, I love the way he talks at the mic when he's being interviewed. He's very well spoken. He's very polished for a young guy.
Right.
And most important is he really is starting to get that outside linebacker position. I was always wondering why Jamori wasn't going to start. I mean, Jamori was this big recruit. But then I watched Trey Moore play and we might have something special in Trey Moore. My concern long term is will P5s notice him? And that is always going to be a concern for, any sort of G5 program. But outside of that, and I just wanted to go on a little Trey Moore rant because I've just been starting to get kind of high on him. And also the fact that he's a local boy. He had 6 quarterback pressures and 1 sack. He's starting to bring that that pass rushing that we needed from the outside linebacker spot. So I really wanted to highlight him because I felt like there were just moments where he was living in the backfield, and that's huge for this team. I mean, as we continue to grow as a defense, if he can continue that momentum, him and Jamori, because Jamori did get in the backfield too, this is gonna be a good defense. Maybe statistically will not be one of the best seasons, but certainly a very talented one. All right, now that we recapped the game, what did we learn from the game?
Well, this team continues to battle through adversity. I mean, the wheels really could have fallen off in the second half after those 3 interceptions, but the defense came through. They held tough and really limited what Middle Tennessee could do in terms of scoring, on those interceptions. And we were able to bounce back on offense and have that touchdown by Brady at the end. So again, you kind of saw that concept of the triangle, right? Where one area starts to have a little bit of issues, and then, the other side, comes together, makes up for it, works together as a team.
I think you're right. I mean, I think the biggest thing is that they go through this adversity, and they went through, I think, a lot of adversity through the first, 3 games. We talked about the out of conference games, the first 3. Right. We spoke to death, and we were worried about it in the summer. Then we finally lived through them, and then we were like, holy crap, we actually got through them. I think that's really hardened this team up. Whether the fact that we went 1-2 against those teams, we can lament some of those losses, but it's strengthened this team, and I think put it in a much better spot, ready for conference play. I think if they had breezed through, say, the Houston game or something, I don't know that they come to play or they're ready to take on Conference USA.
And the funny thing about looking back at the Traylor era at this point is that he's really had to build his depth every year based on injuries. Not necessarily the way that he wants to build his depth, but, he's managed each season to have a bunch of injuries, more than we've seen, in previous years with the Roadrunners. But he's been able to get that next level and probably 2 to 3 levels deep ready and really build depth, which will help us in the future, because a lot of those guys that are getting playing time, are younger and playing sooner than what Traylor probably anticipated.
Well, and I think that's what makes Traylor so great as a UTSA football coach, because the previous 2 coaches had problems when they had an injury to a starter. They had problems with the depth. Obviously, we know why. I mean, it was a young program. We're still trying to develop the recruiting inroads. We're trying to do all sorts of stuff, trying to get the right players in. That's why they struggled once, you had that injury. Traylor, like you said, I mean, he's got one injury. He just plugs in another player. He may kind of whine about it a little bit during, the media days. But, yeah, to his credit, he always has his players ready to play. And even if they have trouble like Frankie does, as long as you're working hard and you give that effort, again, living the triangle, look what happens. I mean, we can complain all we want, but, man, he's done a good job.
Absolutely. I mentioned this earlier, but it was good to see Traylor and the team look so locked into the mindset that they need for conference play. We've talked about them sort of being on this roller coaster. They seemed very dialed in, very focused at this game. And, afterwards, they seemed genuinely happy that they won instead of, kind of being emotional. So I think that sets us up well as we get into really the most important games of the season.
Yeah, and I'll say this. He had even hinted about the fact, now district play starts, right? Right. Harking back to his high school days. But I think they all knew, let's get through our out of conference. It'll get us ready for conference games. And CUSA is going to be tough again. We'll get to some of that when we do our roundup. But, yeah, I mean, they're certainly ready. I questioned it within our preview. Not really sure who was going to show up. I mean, because of just the way the season had gone so far. And that's really what I based it on, but they're ready.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, one of the big takeaways from the game is that, and I said this differently off the pod, but Traylor is willing to take some chances.
Roll them out.
I mean, how many coaches would go for it on 4th and 7 after a roughing the punter call. I mean, you only got 5 yards back to 4th and 7. Most would have just let Lucas punt again, see if they can down it at the 1 yard line, because we were so close, to downing it before that call. And Traylor was like, nope, 4th and 7, all good, we'll go for it. And they got it.
And here's the deal. It's not that he has no faith in the defense. It's that he knows how good his offense is, that he's like, oh, now we're in single digits? Cool. We'll get it. We're going to get a first down right here.
Yeah.
It's you got to love it. I mean, it's the brash, I think, confidence that this team needs.
Yeah, and I'm sure what he would say is that, when it works, we all love it. If it didn't work, we'd be ripping him apart. But
well, and the reason it didn't work like his first couple of years, well, at least his first year, was because he kept doing end arounds. Those don't work. Now he's actually has plays for the 4th down. So, I mean, we also remember we had a 4th and 1 against Texas that didn't work, right?
Right.
Like, so.
Yeah, and then, to see him throw in 2 trick plays again. I mean, hey, you got to give him credit.
It's just part of the offense. And you know what? I think it just makes the game fun for the players. And that's what's really important. They play loose. They play free.
Yeah, and we all love seeing the Cephas and Brady stats as quarterback, from game to game.
Cephas is our best quarterback. Don't at me. Based on the stats, come on. All right, let's do our way too early Western Kentucky preview. Okay, look, overall, I'm going to start out by giving kudos to head coach Tyson Hilton. Look, he's had to reload his staff multiple times, and he could have just folded due to having to do that, much like Frank Wilson did. Hilton hasn't. He just keeps finding talented coaches. He's also finding talented players. He just keeps going, and that's really impressive. This Western Kentucky team may not be as flashy or as explosive as last year's team. They're still pretty good. But it's also still, again, kudos to Helton to bringing this team together. Like, I'm going to tell you now, I'm a Helton fan just because of the fact that, not just because he went and, picked Bailey Zappi out of now Houston Christian University, but of the fact that he's looked at his Rolodex, found those coaches, found those players, and, he just keeps winning. So let's look at the offense. Look, it's looked okay. They've had they haven't played much of a schedule. I mentioned it last week, 124th ranked schedule. UTSA was killed last year for the fact that they had the 129th ranked schedule. Thing is, UTSA went and just won those games. They knew what their schedule rank was, but they went out, they didn't care, and they won. Western Kentucky hasn't done the same thing. They lost to a bad Indiana team, one that got away with somehow upsetting a really good Illinois team that should be undefeated and not be 4-1 at this point. And then they lost to a good Troy team, but I wouldn't say like a very dominant Troy team this past week. So, yeah, they've lost twice, but their 3 wins, to me, unimpressive. Hawaii, which is bottom of FBS. Austin P, which is FCS.
And they actually struggled against Austin P for part of that game. I mean, we watched that. It was more competitive than the score would lead you to believe.
Yeah, and the reasoning comes back is, well, it was their first game under a new coordinator, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay, I get it. I'm not going to take too much away from them. However, they still look like they were going to fall to Austin P. You're right. It was not a very, I think, convincing win. And then they beat up on FIU and started flexing their muscles. I said it last week. It's like beating up a little kid down the street. Who flexes on beating FIU? I don't understand. They were like, oh, we're so good this year. No, you've just run up your stats on some bad teams. Their quarterback is Austin Reed, who came from the FCS. He's no Bailey, though I think Western Kentucky fans are trying to convince themselves that he's the second coming. And they really shouldn't, because I think Bailey would have really run up the score on and looked much more dominant against this schedule than he did last year when they had to play Michigan State. They had to play a much better Indiana team. Austin Reed, he's got a lot of quick throws, but I'm not sure that he has a counter when they don't move the ball much on those kind of sideline passes. 'Cause it's really a lot. It's really trying to move the ball east-west, which is weird because he never really goes too much vertically. Mm-hmm. Now he will. I'm not saying that, he won't at all, but for the most part, they have these quick kind of bubble screen plays, and I guess I'm just not as impressed. I think I was really fascinated more with Zach Kitley's offense last year, as opposed to Ben Arbuckle's offense this year. For the season, Austin Reed's 144 for 200 in terms of passing, 1,669 yards. He's got 17 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. Look, he may not turn the ball over too much, but he's also, I don't think, the game breaker that we're accustomed to seeing from Bailey Zappi. Kai Robichaud is still there at running back. Again, decent runner. He didn't have much of an impact last year in the 2 games that we played him. He scored a couple touchdowns, but mostly they were like goal line touchdowns. He's done better this year. He's got 47 rushes for 315 yards, but only 1 touchdown. Like, again, for the most part, he's a solid player, but I wouldn't say he's quite dangerous. The wide receivers, one guy to watch out for is Dawood Davis. He's a tall wide receiver, very solid. He can be explosive. He's got 34 catches for 476 yards and 4 touchdowns. One guy that stood out to me against the game of Troy was Michael Matheson. He's got 28 catches for 275 yards, 1 touchdown. I thought he moved around pretty well. He's a shorter guy, about 5'10". I'd be more concerned about him only because I thought that Middle Tennessee's short receivers were going to cause us problems. I think our secondary kind of is a little more buckled up in terms of our corners, so I don't see as much of a problem here. But that doesn't mean that if they catch it either in stride or they get some space that they can't make plays. This offense certainly can be explosive. It's just not as dangerous as last year's. Offensive line looks average at best. They got pushed around by Troy's defensive line, and something just to remember as we go through the keys to victory. On defense, they blitz a lot, but it really leaves them susceptible in their secondary. The secondary is not very good, and that's really why they lost against Troy, is that they just couldn't cover once they got their blitzes. Sometimes those blitzes can get home, but it was very much like last year when they were going all-out blitz against us when they knew that we had to hand the ball off to Sincere just to kill the game, right? That doesn't mean that they can't get to the quarterback, because they can. They certainly get to him due to some of these blitzes, but I think they're going to have to be very judicious when they do this against UTSA. Tackling has a lot to be desired there too. That kind of sounds familiar, right?
Yeah.
So let's get to the keys to victory. On offense, here's what UTSA needs to do. Grind them on the ground. Troy showed that if you have a good, solid running game, you'll be able to minimize the amount of time that Western Kentucky has that ball. Same thing that UTSA did last year, both times that they won. The second thing is Frank needs to take advantage of those blitzes. When Western Kentucky blitzes, and they'll show it, they're not very good at hiding it most of the time, at least from what I've seen. He needs to be able to go one-on-one with them, because that's what's going to end up happening. You're going to have our big 3 going one-on-one with their secondary, and it's not going to be much of I'm going to say not much of competition there. Their secondary has got some good players, but I would not say that they're Corey Mayfield or Nick Troy Fortune level. Defensively, we just need to be stout about it with that open field tackling. We've done it before, like against Houston. I think we can do it again. And then the defensive line needs to get pressure on Reed. With that offensive line not really being, I would say, very good, I think our defensive line can get some pressure on them. So here's my way too early prediction. I think Western Kentucky is going to throw a few jabs and uppercuts, and I'm sure they're going to land some, but I think they're just going to be few and far between. This isn't Bailey Zappi out there. We can't just look at it as, well, it isn't Bailey Zappi over there, so we can take it a little bit easier. No, take it seriously. Make it look like it's Bailey over there, and I think UTSA can take care of business. Here's my Hail Mary shot for this game, though. This is the big Traylon Smith breakout game. I think Traylon has a big game. I think he cuts through this Western Kentucky defense, and then Brendan Brady closes it out the end with his brutal physical running. So give me UTSA with the win in the Dome Sweet Dome, 48-38.
All right, before we wrap up our Western Kentucky, can we just make one comment about this game against Troy? The irony being that the Troy quarterback gets hurt and the backup comes in. And when we were watching the game at first, it didn't quite click why they were booing the backup quarterback coming in.
I loved it.
Until we realized that it was, and I'll probably pronounce his name wrong, but Jared Dagey, who had transferred to Western Kentucky, was competing for the starting quarterback position, didn't get it, so he very quickly transferred again to Troy. So he's basically coming out against the team that he left because he felt rejected by them, and he ends up battling through the end and beating him.
Love it. Again, legend.
Yeah.
Just a legend.
Before we go, let's talk about how some of the other games in Conference USA went this weekend.
Let's do it.
You know, we talked about FAU at the beginning of the season potentially being that number 3 or number 4 in Conference USA, but that's not how the season's turning out for them.
Oh, they're going to be 4 all right. Looking forgotten because they are not playing well. They really took it on the chin against UNT there in Denton. Look, I was keeping an eye on North Texas the entire time. Like, they've really become this kind of physical running team. That's not what Latrell wants to run. He wants to be like this, kind of spread team, but he doesn't have the quarterback for it, and he hasn't really recruited anybody to actually be able to be like Mason Fine was for him early in his career. I think this is what they should be because this formula is working for them. And that's what concerns me against UTSA in a couple weeks. I'm going to go as far as say this. Put UTSA on upset alert against North Texas. I know it's homecoming, and homecoming should mean that you're playing a team that is going to be an easy win. Why we went ahead and did that against North Texas, I don't know, because this is a solid North Texas team.
We'll find out in a couple of weeks. FIU, who we talked about earlier, got their first win of the year by beating New Mexico State 21-7.
New Mexico State is bad, but so is FIU. This is just like a toilet bowl game. It's like, I mean,
somebody's got to win.
Yeah, somebody's got to win. But 21-7. I mean, that just tells you just how down both teams are. Like,
and I should have written this down, but they said there were only a handful of kids on that FIU team that were there the last time they beat an FBS opponent. Because it's been so long.
I want to say you can count on one hand, but it might be like 6 or 7 players. It might have been more like 2 hands, but
yeah,
it wasn't much.
Definitely less than 10. So, good for them, because that's got to be demoralizing.
Right.
But, so shout out to FIU for getting your first win in a while. And then UTEP beat up on Charlotte 41-35.
It wasn't as close as I think as the score indicates. Like, UTEP was winning I think like 41-21 at one point. But look, they're also being physical and they're really leaning into this run-heavy offense, which they should. They've got 2 really good physical running backs. They've got a really good defense. But they've heeded my advice, and Dimmel has taken that ball out of Hardison's hands. He has to, because that's really the only way that they're going to, I would say, compete for the title. And UTEP can do it, but I think they finally realized how they have to do it, and that's just taking the ball out of Gavin Hardison's hands. They're now rushing it, I think, more like 3-4 to 1 in terms of passing. So that's their formula.
And then, surprise, surprise.
Woo!
Rice proved that it wasn't a fluke when they beat UAB last year. They beat them for a second year in a row, 28-24, and it was a comeback victory nonetheless.
this Rice team is solid. I mean, their offense still wasn't very good. I think it was still like maybe 200, close to 300 yards of total offense, and that's what they've had like the last 2 weeks that they've played. They almost upset Houston, but man, let me tell you, they're doing what they need to do. Other thing is, this UAB team is good, but much like under Bill Clark, they're just so undisciplined when it comes to penalties. They just cannot keep themselves from committing penalties. And their penalties, and this is what I said last year when I previewed the UAB UTSA game, their penalties aren't like an offsides or, like a false start. These are personal foul 10, 15-yard penalties.
12 penalties for 116 yards.
That's been the norm for them for the longest time over the last few years, and especially haunting them during some of these wins, or these losses, actually. So, if you look back and you see how good UAB has been, but you wonder why they can't beat P5 teams, this right here is why. And why they can't really grab a hold of CUSA at times is because of the fact that they just cannot stop committing penalties.
It's going to be interesting to keep an eye on UAB this weekend because they're playing Middle Tennessee. And the game is at home, so it's in Birmingham. But Middle Tennessee, even though we just obviously spent a lot of time criticizing them, if they can show up against UAB the way they showed up against Miami, I mean, obviously I don't think UAB is going to play as bad as Miami did, but if that Middle Tennessee team shows up and they're, locked in, they could beat UAB, I think, very easily.
Well, and the thing with UAB is that some of their penalties take points off the board. We had that, like UTSA had that happen against UT. That's what's damaging with all these penalties with UAB. So, as much as we, sound like we're kind of making stuff up in the, in thin air here, like, oh, Middle Tennessee, really that Middle Tennessee could beat UAB? No, certainly. I mean, Rice just did. And I don't think Rice is better than UTSA, so.
Yeah, I mean, right now, UAB is a 9-point favorite. If you look at the matchup predictor on ESPN, they have UAB winning 73%. But, given how UAB played against Rice, it's going to be interesting because either they're going to be very upset at themselves, they're going to come back, and they're going to try to take it to Middle Tennessee. But then again, Middle Tennessee could also be pretty upset that they just got beat by UTSA after beating, number 25 Miami. So if they can get their mojo back, this could be a pretty competitive game. So I think it'll be definitely one to watch for the future of Conference USA Championship this year.
Well put.
And then moving on to looking at the Roadrunners in the NFL. Tariq Woolen is lighting it up this rookie season. He got his second interception this weekend. This time he ran it back for a touchdown, so he's now the second Roadrunner to score a touchdown in the NFL.
One of the best things about it is that, told some friends about, Tariq Woolen being in the NFL. All of a sudden I just get these texts saying, Tariq! And I was like trying to figure out, oh no, what do you do now? And he got that interception return, so kudos to them to now, recognizing Tariq right away, but also just now knowing, oh, some UTSA players are in the NFL. So it's like they now text me about it. So really cool to see that, just getting that UTSA brand name out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's great for the future of the program to see these guys being successful, all over Twitter, people talking about him. I mean, it just really, I think is something that's a positive for our recruiting in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on the Hail Mary podcast. I'm Toves.
I'm the Toves.
We'll be back next week to recap our win against Western Kentucky.
A win.
A win.
Birds up.